Hello, coffee lovers from around the world. Jordan River here with another episode of the Coffee, Health, and Science podcast. Today's episode is a first installment in a series that I plan on doing called Understanding Organic, and we're going to be talking about what it means to do organic farming practices, regenerative farming practices, and all things natural farming. This first episode focuses on soil health, and our guest is Marybeth Sanchez, but we are going to do a whole series on this with a myriad of guests, so I'm very excited to present you listeners with these episodes. Speaking of which, I wanted to thank you, Coffee, Health, and Science podcast listening audience. You guys have been so loyal. You've been following the show. We've been growing slowly but surely. I do appreciate you. And we've been making so much noise over here. Purity Coffee has actually upped our offer to you guys. Now you can save 20% at puritycoffee.com plus free shipping with promo code Jordan20. And that's because you guys have been rating and reviewing and subscribing and downloading. So I thank you guys so much for your support. I appreciate it from the bottom of my heart. It allows me to continue to do this. And of course, now Purity is giving back and showing their support. PurityCoffee.com, promo code Jordan20, Jordan20. And check out the Purity Heroes campaign, of course. Donating free coffee to frontline workers and medical workers getting 30% off at PurityCoffee.com. All right, let's get into the show, everyone. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. As I said, you can look forward to more. Thank you all for listening. Enjoy the program. Hello, podcast listeners from around the world. Thank you for tuning in today to the Coffee, Health, and Science podcast. I'm your host, Jordan River. We've got an incredible episode in store for you. Before we jump in, though, please share the Coffee, Health, and Science podcast with a friend. We do appreciate you spreading the show. Leave us a good rating and review. It helps us climb the charts. It truly does help out the show more than you might think. Today's episode, yes, we have a return guest as we return to the topic of natural agriculture, organic farming, and regenerative agriculture. This is something we've really dived deep into on the podcast because when you enter the world of natural wellness, you enter the world of diet, and inevitably you start to, dig into things like food production practices, and that leads you to farming practices. And my God, what a world it has opened up. For those of you who remember today's guest from previous episodes, she is a natural pest management specialist, but she's also very knowledgeable in the world of regenerative agriculture and beyond. We have one of my favorite people on the line in the world, Marybeth Sanchez. How are you doing, Marybeth?
You are so sweet, Jordan. Thank you. I am having a beautiful day. Spring is really feeling good now. Things are blooming. Leaves are finally popping out. Where I live, it comes kind of later than for a lot of people. So when it does, it really lifts one's spirits.
Oh, that's the best. That's exactly right. I'm trying to get as much sun as I can right now. Stay active, stay healthy, as all the listeners know. For the people who might just be tuning in for the first time, though, just give us a quick recap on your background, your farming background, and what brought you to organic practices and eventually studying microbiology.
Well, originally I grew up as the traditional farmer's daughter. My dad grew basically row crops like zucchini, broccoli, artichokes, radishes, things like that. And I worked in the packing house, sorting and packing these things. But I was somewhat familiar with the life in the fields. And I know that my dad's seed was all, the typical commercially available stuff at the time for major farming. There was nothing organic going on. His crops were okay and life went on and that was fine. And it got me a love of the farming life, as it were. And when I was in my younger teen years, my tween years, my mother started getting really into organic food and health food, and that interested me, and I began to study that more, which led me to organic farming and organic growing at a pretty young age, before I had gotten really into college or anything. And so when I got into college, I did decide by that time that I had to do something in the horticulture field, or one knows what one must do.
And, you were hooked.
I was already really drawn to life with plants and, growing just what I could grow on my own in my own little personal gardens at home and things. So I knew that I really wanted to get into horticulture, and I did study that in college for quite a few years. And besides college, just studying on my own, because like any field or profession. The knowledge is constantly changing and being
Goes
updated.
forever. Oh my God.
Yeah.
I've had the pleasure of speaking to some of the biggest names in regenerative agriculture. And every time I end an interview, I feel like I have more questions than I do answers. And I mean that in a good way.
Oh yeah, it's true. I've gotten to listen to and learn from some of the best, and it's so inspiring. And I know you've had some on the show, and it's always so great whenever you do. Keep up.
I'm trying to get Jeff Lowenfels on this show for those who are into this stuff already. That you can look forward to that one. That's going to be a powerful
Definitely.
episode. But when you really realized the differences, right, in these organic practices versus synthetic practices, I almost feel like it's become your mission to protect the soil in people's gardens, and to really, more importantly, educate people on the vast differences in these practices and how they result in not only the end product of your food, but really the environment, whatever soil you're growing in, whether that's the field, the earth, or just your home garden.
Yeah, because originally, like I said, I got into it basically for health reasons, but then you realize it's just not my health that's involved, it's the health of the soil. It's the health of the biology in the soil. And if you don't have that healthy biology in your soil, of course, your plants aren't going to get healthy food, and the food isn't going to be nutritious. So you may be eating all that great lettuce that should have been full of nutrition, but it was grown with, crap nutrition, and it just doesn't have the vitamins and minerals and the
That's right, man.
phyto alkaloids and all the lovely things and whatever that food has.
You are what you eat, man. We've gotten away from some of the very basic, idioms, some of the very basic practices.
If you're eating healthier food, you need less of it because your body is satisfied quicker because you're getting the nutrients. Whereas eating empty calories, you can eat all day.
Yeah,
you're never going to get any nutrient out of it.
That's
your
exactly
body is
right.
still craving.
It's just crazy, this link between agriculture and health and wellness, and that's really what I love exploring. But today, what I'm really trying to do for the listeners, because we've had like Chris Trump on the show, who's a powerhouse in natural farming, but
Yes.
he has his Korean natural farming strategies. He goes deep on that. What I've really never done is laid out for the listeners a cohesive, basic crash course, basically, in understanding what organic farming is, what regenerative farming is, and again, the differences between regular farming practices. So that's what I want to do today with you, Marybeth. And what I would love to do is kind of tell you what I understand, and then you can bounce back and either correct me, extrapolate, verify, tell me if I'm on the right track with my understanding of kind of the history of fertilization. Does that sound good?
It sounds fabulous, darling.
Okay.
Let's do it.
So let's start from the beginning. The natural world had its own, let's put it, its natural state, right? You have things that are dying and decomposing, providing nutrients into the soil, lots of microbiology, lots of these organisms out in the wild. The earth was evolving. We began agriculture not too long ago and did our best to farm under the conditions that were kind of presented to us. And we learned a couple tips and tricks here. But, the earth systems kind of were what they were. And you have all the natural processes, like I mentioned, the natural fungal life, the natural decomposition for nutrients, all of that sort of thing. And then in the 1900s, I would say, especially post-World Wars, we started to toy with synthetic fertilizers. Am I on the right track here so far?
Oh, yeah. It was the worst byproduct of war. Probably, caused more deaths than the war itself. You know what I'm saying?
That's an interesting take. And that's exactly kind of what Chris Trump was saying is exactly that. But to give the listeners an understanding, synthetic fertilizers are doing the job of all of those complex processes we just said, but it's kind of like a magic bullet that misses a lot of different markers. Let me explain. When you have those decomposing plant life, decomposing animals, there's all those processes that are taking elements from different living things, making them bioavailable to the plants that are growing. So many different kind of exchanges going on in the soil.
Yes.
Now, that's all to get the plant the elements it needs, like nitrogen or potassium, phosphorus, whatever it may be. So with these synthetic fertilizers, they said, well, we can basically just chelate these elements, bond them, ionize them, I believe, to a sodium molecule. That's why some people refer to them as salt nutrients. And through this bonding process, it makes them incredibly bioavailable, right? Not only is it now a liquid in a bottle that's stable, which admittedly is a wonderful advancement. You can ship that nutrient now. It's not a living, decomposing, aging thing.
Correct.
And you pour it into the soil and the plants just gobble it up. And that's why it was attractive. You start applying these bioavailable, sodium chelated nutrients. You have a huge bumper crop because the plants are gobbling up these delicious nutrients.
Mhm.
But is it the sodium itself that is harming the microbial life within the soil? Does that sodium not knock back and kill all those living organisms that are doing the exchanging within the soil? Is it more than just that, or is it really all about the sodium?
Well, it's about the quantity that we're putting on. I mean, the
Oh, right.
biology can deal with a little bit of this and that, and it can handle a little bit of this and that, just like your body can handle a little bit of things that aren't good for it, and it'll go ahead and process it through, and you'll come out fine. But it's the amounts that they're putting on are untenable. They are destroying the populations of the biology to such a point that they can't recover. And what you end up with is a dead soil that can no longer retain nutrients. It loses all of its structure. It has no more way to have airflow or water flow. It becomes more and more what's called a sodic soil, SODIC, sodic, meaning it is full of salt. And this salts just make it like a solid, almost like concrete soil. Uh,
Right. It's the
one of the
buildup. I'm glad you brought that up. So it's that this salt doesn't, unless you work to flush it out or tend to the microbes that break down these salts, that will accumulate and it becomes horrible for the soil, right?
Yes, particularly if you are a person who uses plowing, because you make hard pans where you plow, and as deep as your plow go, that's where your hard pan is going to form, and that's where all these salts are going to accumulate. And pretty soon, no matter what you plant, it's gonna just die from too much salt.
Wow. Okay. So it's
Toxic.
more the accumulation, and that's my understanding is once the problem kind of begins, it just exacerbates year over year where they're having to add more and more fertilizers into the soil just to get the same uptake, right? So like you said, it's kind of like even Chris Trump said, we kind of get farmers addicted to this stuff, but it doesn't
Exactly.
pan out in the long run.
Exactly, because they started off with a soil that at least had some biology in it. It had some life in it, and now that they've added all these salts over time, in a very few years, that biology is gone. So even if they wanted to go back, which sometimes they do decide, hey, I was better off with my animals who gave me manure instead of this fertilizer, and the diversity on the farm instead of monocrops, and things like that. Uh, they really You can't go back just instantly. It takes time to build that biology back up again, and now they've become addicted to this because it's either that or nothing, because the soil has become so dead. If you don't use the poison, you've got to spend a lot of time trying to repair that soil when you're not making so much money,
Right.
theoretically. you know
So it kind of entraps farmers, and
yeah.
when the soil gets sick, the plants don't do as well. They become more prone to infestations because of the poor health. It's really a slippery, slippery slope with those, again, chelated salt nutrients. There's a lot of different terms, but
Yes.
that's really what we're talking about. Those bottled synthetic nutrients that has become, unfortunately, what people call traditional farming, even though it is
Yes.
absolutely not traditional farming.
Yes.
It's very young. It's very new.
Exactly.
And again, I don't want to seem like, listen, I don't want to seem like I'm just smashing anyone who's ever used a bottled nutrient. I'm sure. I mean, think of the advancement, right, Mary Beth? Think of all the incredible benefits that could have come from this had we not overused it, and all of that stuff. It's all part of a learning curve and an evolution, I feel. Maybe
Yeah.
that's just my view, but I don't know. What do you think?
Well, there's that, and then there's the fact that people will take a soil that for some reason was not being productive and add the synthetic nutrients, and suddenly notice, hey, it's being productive, and think this must be good stuff. But had they instead added good biology rather than synthetic nutrients, they could have had a self-sustaining system rather than a
That's what we're
system
learning.
you've got to go back and buy more of these toxic things and just keep putting them on. And there's places, for instance, in California, in the Central Valley, the soil has become so toxic over time from the just the normal things that farmers farm with, for all these years. It has become to the point that they can't farm the soil at all.
That's brutal.
They can't even plow it. They get these 12-foot deep plows that can go through concrete, and that's basically what they're doing. And it's to the point where the selenium buildup is it's literally toxic soil.
That's so wild. It's absolutely wild. So that's a kind of overview of how synthetic nutrients came to be, why they were so popular, why they were spread so far, and also their dangers and what we're left with. Maybe we can dig into that for a second. It's not just about, there's so much that goes into it. I think there's really a lot that we don't understand, but when you destroy the microbial life in soil, it's not just that it's hard to grow in. It affects all sorts of stuff. It increases erosion. I was recently. Yeah,
absolutely.
That stuns me, Marybeth. Microbes are actually holding the soil together. I saw people doing a test where, it was increasing. So not just the dirt itself, like they were pouring water through microbe-rich soil and it was coming out clean on the other side.
Yes,
and then they were pouring it through, basically dead, barren soil like you were describing. And not only was it coming out dirty and dusty like you may expect, my understanding is that chemical fertilizers run off more, pesticides run off more, everything runs off more and moves around.
That's part of the solubility. They're so soluble, they're just going to keep on flowing with the water everywhere the water goes. So if your water's coming out the bottom of your pot, so are your nutrients. And if they're going off down to the river, so are your nutrients. And that's causing trouble.
That's really wild. So it's really crucial that we understand how much this stuff affects, waterways, everything. It is really one of the most important aspects of our ecosystem. So now let's talk about the good stuff. Let's talk about how we can fix this. Let's talk about what I really, really think is the solution here. And that's the work that you do, right? What's really amazing is you can take these built up salts and break them down over time with natural biology, revive the soil through natural inputs and adding what, Marybeth? Things like compost tea and beneficial biologies?
Yes, compost tea. And, if you're not good at making it, find a friend who is, or find somebody who is, and get yourself some, get started. There are some biological products on the shelf that you can buy. And, I encourage you to go ahead and use those, whether you're making compost yourself or not, because there are just so many millions of microbes and thousands of different bacteria that you want and different fungi that you want. And who knows what you've got. It's really hard to identify without DNA testing, and not very many people have that kind of lab. I can look at the morphology of the biology and tell you if you're a good guy or a bad guy, but I can't tell you necessarily which exact specific without a DNA testing. And that's over my pay grade.
That's fascinating stuff,
though. What you were talking about with the biology holding the soil together, it's absolutely 100% true. The microbes are making glues, the fungus are making glues and strands, and the strands and the glues, they're literally knitting the soil together and holding it together, so that if you have a flood and something of this nature, you're not necessarily going to lose your field. You're not going to lose all your topsoil. It will absorb and hold. And in fact, the biology in the soil holds water as well, particularly the fungi. So the fungi are really holding water. And so for in a time of drought, your plants have water and your fungi will feed your plant with that water, which is how you can live through both drought and flood if you have really good biology in your soil.
You are preaching to the choir. I was just down in Colombia visiting with the regenerative agriculture coffee farmers down there, and they were in the middle of a drought. And all of their neighbors were suffering because they were in synthetic setups. And the organic soil held the water. It's just one of the many benefits. It held the water much, much better, and their plants were surviving the drought. Really fascinating stuff.
Yes, and in times of flood, I've been told that with the really good soil, even after the flood, they could walk and drive on the soil without being bogged into the mud, whereas their neighbors' fields, you couldn't pass at all.
So fascinating.
Oh, yeah.
So in this organic setup, you'll admit, things do complicate greatly. You're not just dropping nitrogen on your plant and your plant is sucking it up. You're replacing that with what? Natural inputs, like natural biologies, and then adding microbes to make sure that they're exchanging what the plant needs, getting it what it needs. Talk to me about that process a little bit.
Well, the first thing that you're going to try to do, if you suppose you've been addicted to salts all these years, or your plants have been addicted to salts all these years, when you take them off, you can't just cold turkey them really, because they've got nothing going on there at all.
Oh, wow.
So you have to kind of, those first few years, sort of wean them. Like, for instance, there's a big commercial farmer named Gabe Brown, and he decided the first thing that he was going to do was to sell all his plowing equipment so he would no longer ever plow again. And there would be no temptation to ever plow again. And then that same year, I believe he did half of his crop fertilized and half of it without adding any extra fertilizer. And he noticed that the yields were no different. There was no difference. It, in fact, sometimes was better without the fertilizer. Okay, but already no plowing and using minimal, very minimal fertilizer. And each year successively using less, and maybe instead of synthetic fertilizers, you're using more traditional organic types such as manures and things like that.
Right.
Not ammonium sulfate or whatever.
And that's a little more challenging from what I understand, because again, your plant's not going to respond to it instantly necessarily. If you're using those natural inputs, you have to give time for the processes to work.
Yep.
Is that correct?
You really want to have your field prepared before your plants come in. But that's what Elaine Ingham will say. Sometimes you've got the world's worst soil. And so you do have to go ahead and plow it one last time just to get some compost, some organic matter into the top of that soil.
Wow.
And then you'll never, ever, ever plow again.
That's crazy. And is that the same thing when people say a no-till garden? Sometimes I see veggie gardeners saying, my garden is no-till. It's about not disturbing the soil, not busting up that fungal life and microbial life. Okay.
Exactly. And some people will do what's minimal tilling, they'll call strip tilling, where they'll just do a line. I mean, literally the width of the stem that they have to put into the soil.
Oh,
but
that's
they
cool.
won't plow anything in between the rows. And so they're maintaining at least enough of the biology that it can grow really quickly back into those spaces where they actually did plow. So they're not annihilating that entire field.
Right.
They're just doing little minimal things for the variety of crops. But, like I think we've discussed before many times, so much of it is never letting your soil be bare. The main thing that helps the nutrients recycle is to always have ground cover in your soil, either a living growing crop or some kind of mulch, hopefully non-plastic mulch, some kind of
soil covering
with organic matter once. Yeah, something
right.
that was living. But you never ever let the soil be uncovered, and that's the way the nutrients and the biology begins to thrive, and the bacteria begin to return, and the fungi return. And it's basically, if you have a crop to harvest, you leave everything else in the field except for that part that you're harvesting. And if for some reason the whole entire plant and all of it has to go, you have to have something else covering. That's where you need cover crops. You need something.
Man, and that's not what they would do in a traditional setup in most cases, as far as our modern ag, right?
No. Yeah, they'll plow several times a year, and they'll literally turn the entire field upside down. And every time they do that, they're just bringing up new wheat seeds.
Yeah.
And absolutely decimating any chance of a fungus ever getting established. The beneficial fungus.
That's wild. It's absolutely wild.
All those terrible powder molds, they're always floating around in the air no matter what you do. So you're not eliminating that. And now they're relying on the chemical, pre-Monsanto ready or Roundup ready kind of weed seeds. Oh Jesus! They're getting some weeds that the Monsanto won't, or the Roundup won't kill anymore.
Well, there you go. That's what happens when you try to treat it with that kind of mentality. And I think that's kind of what this leads to. Is this has to be a shift in mentality here. But I feel we are making progress. It's a developing field, and I would like to take a moment to pause and clarify something, which is when you see organic products on the shelf, that's an organic certification. And that's actually not what we're talking about specifically today. What we're talking about is organic farming practices, and it's a much wider variety of practices, ranging from just not using synthetic fertilizers and pesticides to more regenerative agriculture, where you're tending and building the microbial life and fungal life, to permaculture, which is like the next step up. And you can dig into these subjects yourself if you want to learn more about them. But the organic certification usually encompasses some of that. I know it varies. I'm not super educated on food products. I do know that coffee organic certification is pretty strict. According to Ildi Revi, she talks about what all goes into that, and it has to do with a lot of what we're talking about, plus a lot of transport and storage and things like that. So I did want to make that clarification. When you see organic on the shelf, those are certifications, and they mean something very specific. What we're talking about today is organic farming, regenerative farming practices, which doesn't always equate one-to-one, but if you can find that, like a Purity Coffee, if you can find those products, support those farmers however you can. Right,
Yeah,
Marybeth?
absolutely. And I wanted to mention before I forget on the organic thing, EDTA, when we're talking about synthetic chelation methods, one of the famous ones they use in many products that are certified organic use EDTA and things that are similar to that, which are considered technically organic. However, they are so persistent in the soil and they don't break down, and they do cause health problems. They don't break down well in our bodies. They are very persistent to breaking down compared to
That's
other.
not cool.
Yeah, so they're actually considered an environmental pollutant, and they're in a lot of organic, quote unquote, synthetic, not synthetic, like organic fertilizers, particularly liquid ones, where
bottled fertilizers, right?
Yeah, it's used as a preservative and also as a chelator. And it's just not the one that you would choose if you were, like we said, we're the purists. What can we do? I got to tell you what the purists would do. They would only use humic acids or compost tea with their own humic acids derived from their own compost tea. Humic acids are the way to chelate in nature. That's the way the biology does it. They use the humic acids in the healthy, biologically healthy soil. And that chelates all the minerals naturally in such a way that is no way could it be ever considered biologically or ecologically unfriendly. Wow. So the plants can take up nutrients as they desire, and if they don't want them, it's also chelating the minerals that they don't want. And so it's just like having that storage space that the plant knows what it wants. It can get it out of its cupboard anytime. The cupboard's right there, the root system, in the form of the bacteria and the fungi. It's like, we've talked about it before. They put out chemical signals, the plant does, and says to the outside world what it wants, and the outside world being the bacteria and the fungi is right there at the root system already, because they know that's where the sugar's coming from, and sugar's coming from the plant. And they trade sugar for minerals or carbohydrates for minerals and things like that.
So again, you need the help if you're in the organics. You can't just exist in a vacuum like you can with the synthetics.
You need the whole food web working with you in order to really have a balanced system. I think that's what goes wrong a lot of times when people are in a transitional stage and they really don't have all of the components of the food web yet. They've got to start, but they still have a ways to go. And I mentioned Gabe Brown before, is because he was such a big, regular, normal, traditional guy who grows corn and stuff, corn and cattle and that kind of thing. But when he transitioned, it was just so amazing when he goes and tells you the history of, because he went out on faith doing this. And then there were like 3 years in a row where the crops were destroyed by hail before he could harvest. So, you can be tried and tested this way, but if you can hang in there, he's got the most successful farm now in the Dakotas where he lives, and people line up. He cannot keep up with the demand. People line up for him. He sells direct to the public now. He sells his organic beef and his organic chickens and his organic produce. He also sells seeds for cover crops because he grows cover crops religiously and a lot of varieties. And so he's got a lot of baskets. He's a great preacher of don't put all your eggs in one basket, because if this or that enterprise fails, you need something to back you up.
Right.
If your whole crop goes down 3 years in a row from hail, you need something else to eat, to have food on your table.
We're finding a lot of problems with the traditional monocropping. I mean, that's just one example right there. But like you were saying, the lack of cover crops, the overtilling, we're facing a lot of problems here, but I do feel we're working through it. And there are a lot of great examples, like you just mentioned, like a Chris Trump, who's saying, hey, you can do it organic and increase your bottom line. Like,
yes,
it's really exciting. One thing I want to get your take on, now I'm really learning about the genetic effects of organic. So
Mm,
when people go and, like you said, buying seeds, for instance, and you buy
yes.
organic seeds, it actually does matter. There is information stored in that plant's biology depending on how it was grown. And if it was grown organically, it's going to have different expressions. It's going to do better in an organic setup right off the bat, as opposed to a plant whose lineage wasn't grown in organic setup. This is all things I've heard from farmers, from botanists. Is that true in your estimation? And have you experienced that?
Well, I probably haven't been studying hard enough, but it sure makes sense to me. You know what I mean? Any of your what I do know about by your past history, like generations are affected by what happened to their grandparents, for instance. Suppose there have been studies such as if your grandparents went through a famine, it doesn't affect their children; it affects their grandchildren, and if
Wow,
they're born with weird things because of it. That was
that's
fascinating,
fascinating.
but
Yeah.
it's part
Same
of
thing though.
yes, that the generations are affected that way by what happened to the previous generations. And I mean, it kind of just makes sense with your whole genetic lineage.
No reason it wouldn't
Horticulture.
happen in plants too. Yeah, horticulture. That's exactly right. So we'll see how this goes as more, farmers switch to these practices, and as the consumer becomes educated as well and votes with their dollar. That's really what I encourage people to do.
Yeah.
Find the brands who are representing themselves properly, to
Mhm.
where the profit is getting back to these farmers, and they're being paid for the extra work that they're putting in. So that's
It's
really,
actually
really,
worth it. Yeah.
yeah. And here's my whole thing, Mary Beth. We're
Mhm.
understanding all, not even all, we're understanding some of the damages by these synthetic practices. Do
Mhm.
you believe, like me, that there's just a lot of this we don't understand? I think it's important to get back to this regenerative, natural agriculture system, and these types of practices, because we don't understand the complexities of the soil microbiology. And I don't think we should stop trying to understand them and stop trying to study them, but we got to get back to what we know works, regardless of if we understand every individual facet. You know what I mean? Do you agree with that?
Correct. I agree 100%. It's we have just this field is really in its infancy because we forgot the old things when we were sold the bill of goods regarding the synthetics, and we
Hmm.
went for years and years and years on the synthetics before somebody started to notice well, it seems to not work anymore. Just like for a heroin junkie, after a while, junk doesn't work anymore. You just have to have it to live, and
Doesn't get
it's
you there. Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's what farmers are finding now with these practices. It doesn't get you there. So,
and not only that, it gets to the point where, like I was saying, in certain places you can't even grow in the soil anymore. It's been
geez,
turned into concrete.
it's wild. It's absolutely wild. So,
It's
I think that, first of all, I'm enamored with folks like you who do all sorts of testing. I want to do a follow up episode with you all about pesticides. For those listening, Mary Beth works with different natural pesticide companies, tests sprays to see which ones negatively affect microbiology, which ones don't. So is that like you're spraying these pesticides and then you observe the soil under a microscope and see if there's less movement? Is that how that sort of thing works?
pretty much, yeah. My day job is I work in a nursery. I am the manager in the nursery, and we've got the microscope there, and we know how to do our little soil samples
Huh,
and get the leaves and see what we can see with our scopes. And
that's so crazy.
so, yeah, it's good. So we can that way sort of assess what's going on in the soil or in the compost or in the compost tea, and see, how good the biology is, or if something's really scary, or if it's just dead, or various possibilities. But because I work in the nursery, there's always sales reps coming with the various products. So I just, by default, get a chance to test all these things.
That's
And so
crazy.
it's
That's so
always great
cool.
to, actually have the microscope where I can see, are the microscopic mites dying when I spray or not? What is going on in this? Or the thing in the soil, is it really there or is it not?
I love it.
This has been fascinating. The micro world it's a place that can suck you in. It is fun to look at, and you can spend an inordinate amount of time just looking at a slide with some little bacteria swimming around in there.
Oh, I absolutely am so fascinated and, like I said, enamored with what you do. So we'll have you back on. I want to do a whole episode on pests and talk about kind of reframing how we look at pests, much like we talked about reframing how we looked at fertigation and fertilization today. So I hope that was an eye-opening expose for the natural farming versus synthetic farming world. Again, just about spreading this information and voting with your dollar. Right? Find out the values that work for you, who you want to support, and understand that this stuff is pretty impactful. So do what you can. And again, thank you, Marybeth, for spreading this knowledge. I am so fascinated by it, and I look forward to speaking with you again.
Well, thank you, Jordan. You spread it more than I do, and I'm happy to do my part anytime.
MBSIPM on Instagram. Did I get that right? At MBSIPM?
That's the one. You did perfect. Thank you very much, sir.
If you have gardening questions, if you have natural pest control questions, regenerative ag questions, get at Marybeth. Thank you so much one more time, Marybeth. We love you here at the Coffee, Health, and Science Podcast. Have a great day out there in the sun. Enjoy your coffee. We'll let you go.
Thank you, dear. It's been a pleasure talking to you. You have
Take
a good
care of yourself, Marybeth. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
We sure love Marybeth. That's all for today's show. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. Share the show, like I said. Give us a rating and review. We do appreciate it. This is Jordan Rivers signing off, saying have an extraordinary day. We'll see you next time on the Coffee, Health, and Science Podcast.